Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Conversations in Time from the ORC. This is episode 4, What If? Ian, today, what's the what if?
Well, what we thought we'd discuss today is what if Henry VIII didn't split with Rome, didn't have to ask for a divorce from...
Well, I think he would have had to, I think he would have to have asked for a divorce.
You're right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, yes, he would have asked for a divorce and he would have been given one.
Yeah, and how that would have changed things. That's the what if. It's Henry VIII wants to get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope grants it. So the pressure in terms of moving to an alternative approach to divorce essentially disappears, and he's then free to marry Anne Boleyn. Now, when you look at it, because this is quite, is a while ago, 600 years, it was the 16th century. We're not going to essentially look at every potential in and out of what could have changed. There are some key things which wouldn't have happened, quite clearly.
Too many threads. I mean, if you extrapolate the threads to the 20th century or the 21st century, there's just too many. So
That's right, yeah.
We'll try and stick on the immediate impact, or certainly the impact of, 100 years or so, a couple hundred years.
So we'll take the easy route and essentially say we ignore all of the potential changes that would have happened. I mean, in particular to the monarchy, for a start.
So we don't want to discuss necessarily him having an heir, a male heir, that is, rather than because obviously he did have male heirs, but they all died in childbirth.
Well, he had one, didn't he? So if we start with Henry VIII,
he died when he was 5 or something, didn't he?
No, he was 15.
Okay,
right, he was correct. King for 2 years or 3 years,
right?
But not king. There was a regent.
A regent, yeah.
But if we assume Henry VIII still had 6 wives, right? So he still wanted a son.
Yeah.
Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but she would have been brought up a Catholic, not Protestant. I mean, she wasn't brought up a Protestant because it was. I'm not sure. It wasn't Catholic. It was more. It was
Anglican, I suppose. It was Anglican, which is a form of Catholicism, but with a small c, arguably. But that's a whole different podcast. But yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So let's assume that Henry VIII still had 6 wives, and that level of succession carried on. So Mary still became Queen Mary. I mean, she was Catholic and died. Elizabeth I was a Catholic. I mean, the first thing that wouldn't have happened potentially was there would have been no Armada, because she'd be Catholic. Why would Philip want to invade Britain? I thought it was a religious reason.
Well, it was, yes, but then if you want to take a step back, what happened before that as well is there's all the things that wouldn't have happened. Would he have dissolved the monasteries? Would he have?
Oh, right, no, you're right. So that's the first thing that would have happened, and I think that's quite a key one. Is that
dissolution.
The disillusionment.
Get your teeth into it,
that's right. Yeah, the disillusionment of the monasteries wouldn't have happened. That's pretty significant.
Because ultimately, you could argue that was a side benefit of breaking with Rome, because people can Google it, as we always say, but we don't believe that was his primary purpose. It was all about him. But once he'd broken with Rome, he thought, well, there's these Catholic-based organisations who've got lots of wealth. They were the massive wealth in the country. I mean, arguably, they were more wealth than he had. Every major town and many other towns had abbeys and monasteries, and they were the centre of economies, agriculture, metal bashing, call it what you like, as it was in those days, in terms of making.
And a lot of land as well.
And land, yes. Taxation and stuff. So not to mention the physical buildings themselves, which obviously, although they were ultimately destroyed, were not just burnt to the ground. They were taken away and used to build.
They were, but you could, one of the things that would be different, certainly in Britain, is that there'd be a lot more older medieval buildings. Of the buildings that survive, the cathedrals and whatever, they are pretty spectacular.
So you wouldn't have done that, but then ultimately that would give him a problem, because if he didn't dissolve those monasteries, where would the wealth come? And kings kings and queens, but mostly kings in most of Europe at that point, why did they need money? Well, they needed money to wage war, and if he didn't have that money, he wouldn't have money to wage war. Who was he waging war against? Well, he was waging war against the Scots and the French. So if he wasn't, it's quite interesting about the Armada thing. The Spanish arguably would have come to assist. You know, the Spanish Armada was probably the most, in fact was the on paper, the strongest naval force. Obviously, in the real history, it didn't do well, but a combination of storms and luck, and call it what you like. So the Spanish would have come to England to assist him with his wars against the Scots and the wars against the French, because he couldn't have just taken the money for the monasteries. If he'd done that, he'd have broken with Rome again, and that was something that
So I don't think I could be wrong, but I don't think his primary reason was money to get money out of the church. I mean, he might have recognised that it was there.
In the primary history, the real history, I think it was. He was looking at these monasteries going, well, I've broken with Rome.
But I thought the idea of him breaking with Rome was because he wanted a male heir.
Oh yeah. No, 100%. But once he'd done that, he had nothing stopping him.
But if he hadn't got the urge to break from Rome,
correct. No, I agree. And that's my point. So if he didn't break with Rome, he wouldn't have dissolved the monasteries and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and he wouldn't therefore have any money to go on expeditions to France or expeditions to Scotland to fight wars. So that would have given him a big problem.
Yeah. So, okay, I mean, we could nitpick on that particular thing, and it's a bit detailed in terms of the outcome of what that might have been. I mean, ultimately, he could have taxed more, he could have done something else.
Yeah, but the ability, I think the ability for medieval, or certainly Tudor kings to tax people was relatively limited, because the vast majority of the population didn't have anything that was worthwhile, and it was very much a problem if you tax people too much, because the population could rise up, and not so much the population. It would be the barons in the country, the various lords that are hanging around from the Norman times in terms of the structure of the feudal arrangement. They would put up with so much taxation, but again, he couldn't tax them as much just because he felt like it.
All right, so England doesn't have as much money, so it can't prosecute as many wars. But
correct.
Okay, so let's move forward a bit. Yeah. So we'll end up with lots of magnificent abbeys and churches and all sorts of things that have been destroyed, but would now still be there.
Yeah.
The next sort of key thing in terms of moving it forward would be Charles I. So let's assume he's still a Catholic.
Well, he was a Catholic.
He was a Catholic
because he was a Stuart. So Charles I was a Stuart, and they were Catholics.
So that means that Cromwell,
Mary Queen of Scots, James VI, James II of Scotland, James II, James I of England, they were Catholics. That was arguably one of the reasons of the War of the Nations, as it's now called, or the English Civil War, if you want to call it. That was one of the causes, not the major cause, but it was one of the complications.
Yeah. So we can assume that could have still happened, is what I'm saying. Well, I mean, I know it wasn't the only reason that he was the disillusionment with Parliament and his erratic behaviour wasn't all religious. There was policy decisions.
No, it was one of the confusing factors. So the primary purpose, or the primary cause of the English Civil War, as we know, was the argument between landed gentry and Parliament. Although most of Parliament were landed gentry as well, but they chose to have different views on life. But once the actual war started, the politics of the religion of the king, and particularly in this is why it's more normally called the War of the Nations, because Ireland was drawn in, Scotland was drawn in. That was mostly around about the religion. That by that stage, Scotland was mostly Protestant, although it had lots of internal wars to make it so. So the Reformation that happened in Scotland, and in this timeline, would have happened anyway, because there was no impact in Scotland and of Henry VIII breaking from Rome. The Scottish Reformation was based on the Lutheran principles that were going through Germany and the Netherlands and Scandinavia and stuff. So it didn't need Henry VIII to break from Rome to become Protestant. It was becoming Protestant anyway. So and if we don't change any of the heirs through this process, we still have a Stuart king who joins the kingdoms of England and Scotland, not the countries, but the kingdoms together under a single crown. So he's still the king. England's, in our timeline, is Catholic. Scotland is Protestant. We'll park Ireland for a bit.
No, we have to come on to one because that's an interesting scenario with Ireland. Yeah.
But the question is, England could, probably would have turned Protestant as well, even though the king is a Catholic. There will be.
Yeah, but why? In terms of the what if, I mean, if the royal family is Catholic, then why would?
Well, because it's not quite the Age of Enlightenment. That comes on.
That's later, isn't it?
That comes later. But the logic of corrupt churches, or the corrupt church, being replaced by a more simple. I'm trying to avoid the word Puritan, because that comes a little bit later, or not too far later. It certainly comes later in Henry, obviously. But that sort of Puritan, that was a thread that was coming through England anyway. Not in Henry's time, but later on, obviously, during the Elizabethan period and obviously the Jacobean period with James. The Puritan thread, which is a Protestant outlook on religion, that was coming anyway. It happened in the Low Countries, it happened in the northern parts of Germany, not all of what we call Germany now. Obviously, it wasn't Germany as such, but it happened in Scotland. Why wouldn't it happen in England? The king's unless the king chooses to try and suppress it, which the crown, as it would be. Elizabeth, unless they try to suppress it, which they probably would, but would they be successful? Because it's got an appeal to the masses rather than the.
But for the purposes of the What If podcast,
yeah,
we have to, we don't want to end it there and say, they would have gone Protestant anyway.
No, but I think it would have been different.
Thank you. Good night.
It would have been. It could have been. It's a different type of product. What you see as English Anglican Protestantism. Catholicism with a small c. Would it have been more extreme Protestantism?
Well, that's a good tack in that England still would have gone non-Catholic,
but more extreme Protestant,
but not Anglican.
Yeah, and it would have been more of a puritanical Presbyterian Lutheran type religion, as is in most of Northern Europe and Scotland. That's not particularly respectful of hierarchy. So there's very little hierarchy in those religions. There's no archbishops and what that in theory might have even threatened the crown or the monarchy, because again, if you've got no respect of hierarchy within your church, do you have a respect for a person who's allegedly born?
But then you could argue, let's say from a what if perspective, and I don't know how this changes the thing to do with Ireland, because we'll come on to that in a minute. But Cromwell or a Charles I Republican type era could still have happened with Puritans, which it did. But instead of going back to, an Anglican-based religion when Charles II came back, because the government didn't stay Puritan and the monarchy wasn't Puritan.
Nope.
It was more the Anglican, sort of semi-Catholicism type hierarchical, with bishops and all this sort of stuff type thing. We can move on from there. So,
all right, but I think the distinction.
I'm trying to just keep the timeline moving.
Well, okay, but the distinction I'm trying to make is that there's this question: is that the king, as in Henry, doesn't become a Protestant? He'll leave Protestant as it is for the time being. Mary's a bit of a distraction because she's only there for a few years, but Elizabeth is still a Catholic. So therefore, the Wars of Spain don't happen. The Armada doesn't happen, as we've discussed. But the question, therefore, is the question is still though: does England gradually become Protestant, irrespective of what the monarchy is doing? Does England become Protestant?
So, I think we're ultimately saying it probably would have.
Yes, and
that's what we're saying is that it would have taken longer, and the Protestantism that was in England would have been different to and what actually happened.
And then there's implications to what England then does become. Does England have? Yes, it will still have colonies in America, but who are those? Who are those colonists in America in this timeline? Are they Puritans as they were originally, or many of them were originally in the existing timeline, or are they displaced Catholics? Because that's kind of people...
Well, if the reason for the American forefather, the
colonies,
what do they call the founding fathers?
Founding fathers.
Yeah, if they hadn't have been driven out of
that's the thing. Yeah, that's
England is the story.
Well, the thing is about that, and this is what we're off the tangent, is that people Google it out there, guys. But the people have this thing that they were driven out because they were being persecuted. In actual fact, they left because they couldn't persecute other people as much as they wanted to. These Puritans wanted to tell people how to live their lives. It wasn't a question of, look at these people, let's pick on them because that's what human nature is. The general population of England didn't pick on Puritans because they didn't like them, and it was just, let's kick their heads in because they're different. Puritans wanted a pure country, and they weren't allowed to do it because people didn't want it. So they thought, let's go and set up our own country where we could be as pure as we like. Now, obviously that didn't work either because human nature isn't like that. But
so the argument then is that the founding fathers may not have actually set sail because
correct,
the country might have been a bit.
But somebody would have done.
Well, the other areas in the US, it wasn't all New England.
Correct.
Was settled, and
it wasn't all English. Come to that, obviously, it was French.
So arguably, the Americas' history would be slightly different.
Well, it could have been significantly different in the sense that if it wasn't Puritans who went to America and thought, right, we want our own. All right, they didn't go there saying we want our own country, but they wanted to be on their own. They wanted to be independent that we're talking about. They wanted to be autonomous, mind their own business, be as nasty as they like to whoever they want to be without people in London telling them what to do. If it wasn't them, it could have been somebody else. And it could have been somebody else who would have been quite happy being part of the British Empire, a la Australia or Canada.
But you're making the assumption that the people who went to America and survived are all initially were all Puritan, and then it grew from there. And I'm not sure. To be fair, we've gone off at a tangent where that I haven't looked anything.
Well,
so I don't know what happened in terms of. We know that the Puritans went, but there were plenty of other people who went,
correct,
and they weren't
correct,
Puritans.
Correct, but very few of them were Catholics.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, so had the Catholics decided that they didn't like pure Protestantism, as in Lutheran and Presbyterian and the sort of the Northern European Low Country model, would they have moved as much as they could in those days to America?
Well, there's an interesting tangent for the what if is that there's a lot more Catholics in America than there were Protestants, and then that would have had a significant difference. And how would
Spain and France? Spain was a declining power certainly by the middle of the 1600s. France obviously was a rival to England, or certainly in parts of the world, most of the parts of the world it was. Whether it was a power that could invade England and stuff is debatable. But so there's that aspect of, like all things, if you choose to go down one religion that is completely different. I mean, it's not completely different in the sense of it's like Islam, but it's different in as much as they certainly disliked each other. Protestants and Catholics. That would have changed much more than just things in this country.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, the consequence of a more or less Puritan population in the US or more Catholics may have influenced what happened with the Revolutionary War.
Well, exactly. So whether a majority Catholic population in the colonies and not in England anymore.
I mean, although the revolution wasn't based on religion, it was taxation.
No, it had obviously nothing to do with religion, but it might have done. The attempt to be free from London might have come much earlier. Could have come much earlier. Could have come 70, 80 years earlier. And in reality, given the technology of the time, they would probably have lost.
Yeah. The other thing associated with Catholics is that you would end up having lots of priests, because they go hand in glove.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be necessarily the people's, the priests have an influence on the population if they were Catholic.
Certainly, that's the cliche. Is that?
Well, I don't know. I'm just saying that that is a difference.
That's a sort of clear. That's a model that we have in our consciousness from Ireland, because we know more about Ireland than we do about Spain and France, because obviously they speak English. Their history is part of our history, and their history is part of ours. And our history is part of theirs, rather. Yeah. So how much that there's plenty of things go or went on in Ireland which have nothing to do with Catholic priests.
Well, let's talk about Ireland then.
Yeah.
So
let's rewind a wee bit. So the scenario is that just to remind ourselves, England's still part of the Roman Catholic Church as such. All right. There's a whiff of Protestantism coming in, but it's still a Catholic country, and let's take it up to the sort of Cromwell time.
Yeah. So if we talk about Ireland, and one of the issues with Ireland was that there were a number of the landed gentry who left Ireland to go to France because of the potential persecution.
Mm-hmm.
And that created that spare land that Protestants then...
spare in the sense of...
Well, there weren't any owners. There weren't any landowners.
There was plenty of
people.
People, yeah.
That's right. But there weren't any...
The plantations, which were mostly in the north, but not completely, obviously.
Yeah, so if they hadn't have left, they wouldn't have created the... No, but don't forget, the Protestants only landed in Northern Ireland because there wasn't anybody in charge to stop them from doing that.
Yeah.
So if they hadn't have left, then they wouldn't. The chances are they wouldn't even have tried.
Yes, and
which means the whole of Ireland would have remained Catholic.
Yeah,
and there wouldn't have been a Northern Ireland as a separate entity.
Yeah,
I just think that could be that could be a consequence.
But then is that just like many of these what ifs? There's always a degree of inevitability. It appears in timelines, but so we agree that James wouldn't have encouraged people to go to what is the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland. There wouldn't have been so all sorts of people were encouraged to go. So as you say, it was originally landed gentry were encouraged to go to set up plantations for agricultural reasons, but they filled a vacuum individually, but there wasn't a vacuum of labour, but they brought labour in as well. So they brought poor people from Scotland and England to Ireland. That caused lots.
But then that wouldn't, all I'm saying is that...
So that wouldn't have happened. Okay, so let's assume that didn't happen. But going back to my creaking old door of if England, Scotland by this stage was already Protestant in the mid 60s.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Although there was still plenty of battles to be found to be fought rather around that low level stuff. But organised pitched battles, but not necessarily the Battle of Waterloo, if you know what I mean, to picture it. But certainly pitched battles, organised people on horseback and all that sort of stuff. But England, again, I think still starts to become Protestant, irrespective of the monarchy.
No, I'm not disputing
and then you've got this country. And this is why it ties into the War of the Nations or the English Civil War, is that what happens then is the monarchy starts to, as Charles did, pulls on religion. So he can raise armies based on religion. So he raised Scottish armies and Irish armies on the basis that he's Catholic, and he could raise Scottish and Irish Catholic armies. Is England, and we can, the monarchy and or Parliament going to look at Ireland and say completely Protestant, completely Catholic, and think that's okay then? I don't think it is. I think it's going to say that's not okay. I don't want some country at my back, so to speak, where I've got countries at my front and countries at my back that are Catholic. We're turning into Protestants by osmosis, if you like, right? Even if the monarchy isn't, but the Parliament.
But wasn't Ireland ruled by England at that time?
I honestly don't know.
And there wasn't a king of Ireland or an Irish
Parliament.
Parliament.
There has been a king of Ireland, but the incorporation of Ireland into Great Britain, and again, if you Google this, was either 1801 or 1805. I can't remember. I think it was 1805. So
because one of the things during the Revolutionary War was that there was a lot of unrest in Ireland, and the English government was having to station troops in Dublin to quell it.
But that was protecting the plantations to a large extent, and then Dublin wasn't a plantation area. Dublin was the major port into Ireland, so the goods.
But that was where the troops were stationed,
correct? Because it was protecting the port, protecting the trade.
So it wasn't as if it was a separate country against England. It was just a Catholic district.
Well, it was never part of England. It was part of Great Britain.
Well, yeah, sorry,
but only if you think of the Union Jack, the Union Jack is the Scottish saltire and the English cross of St George. It only became the Union Jack as you'd recognise it today in 1805 when the cross of St Patrick, which I'm not quite sure what that is because you don't see that today, but the cross of St Patrick, which is the red part of the Union Jack. So in terms of the Charles and the two Charles, and Charles I and Charles II and Queen Elizabeth, Ireland was not part of any country. It was not part of the kingdom.
No.
It wasn't the king didn't have authority over the country as such. It was the Parliament certainly didn't. It was a colony, but it was large parts of Ireland, certainly in those days, would be completely inaccessible, rural and inaccessible.
Yeah,
very wild country.
Well, that's it. I mean, it was a rural country with one big town.
Yes, so almost fiefdoms around Dublin and the plantations in the north. So if you didn't have that, it's still there. It's a homogeneous mass of what would be in many cases people. What's the word? In sympathy with the monarchy in England, in sympathy with England as it's Catholic, but if and when, as I suspect, would England became by osmosis Protestant, Ireland would lose sympathy with England, and vice versa.
So the question could be that because there's no Northern Ireland, so there's no focus.
It certainly wouldn't be. It would be one homogenous country.
Yeah.
That's
so if Protestantism was starting to become more prevalent in England, and that was attempted in Ireland, it wouldn't focus on Northern Ireland because there's no reason for it to focus on any particular part of Ireland, and that either would have been something that fizzled out or something that didn't fizzle out. Arguably.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
And now whether it would be worse now because of it, or whether it would be better.
It would have been different. I mean, I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The question is, which is a completely different what if, is why didn't Protestantism take hold in Ireland? I mean, there are Protestants in Ireland who have got nothing to do with migration from Scotland or England. Although most of the people in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, who are Protestants, do have antecedents that way. So.
Is it Protestantism or is it Anglicanism or
Well, it's mostly Anglican. It's Episcopalian as the term goes. As a generic sort of.
A vicar with a dog collar.
Anglicism outside of England is Presbyterian, is
Episcopalian.
Yeah, but there would have certainly been somebody somewhere would have attempted to bring Protestantism to Ireland in the same way that they did to Scotland, the same way they did to the Low Countries and in Scandinavia. In all cases, that resulted in wars and death, and so that could have happened in Ireland. Is Ireland different from those countries? I don't think so. I mean, certainly around the East Coast, Ireland, Dublin had been a city for thousands of years. It had been certainly hundreds of years. It had been a Viking town, so there would have been inroads there. It would have cost lots of, if you look at the model in Scotland, the wild west of Scotland, the Islands and Highlands, are mostly Catholic because basically it was too difficult to impose Protestantism. You couldn't impose it on those people because it wasn't worth it, frankly. Well, unless you actually massacre everybody, how do you actually do it? And you can't even massacre them all because there's not enough of them there. They're spread all over the place. That's so you just leave them to it. You don't let them. They had no interest in setting up a rival country, so to speak, in these wild areas. So that would have been true of Ireland for most of its western, the very rural middle and west parts. But Protestantism could have taken root in Dublin, Belfast, not in the way it did, but in the way it could have done. And it could have done it peacefully. Who knows?
It's fair to say that that's almost a what if in its own right.
Exactly.
If we knew enough about it,
Ireland could have been Ireland could have been a slightly more balanced country in the sense of not being completely 95% ruled by the Church of Rome and all that implied for its development.
I mean, certainly, one of the things you could say there wouldn't be the Troubles. There might have been there would have been different things.
There wouldn't have been the Troubles as seen
we
in
know
the 20th century. No, because that was almost a result of the way that Britain, being mostly Protestant, looked after Ireland being mostly Catholic, and there was just no compatibility. But if Ireland was more mixed, who knows? I mean, they still would have wanted, they're still culturally different from most of the Great Britain, so they've still at some point had a split. But whether it would have been as visceral and nasty is debatable.
Yeah.
So, so it like all things, it all boils down to religion. Somebody makes a decision to do something in the 1500s for his own personal circumstances. Yes, it would have delayed Protestantism. Or there's an argument that just because Scotland became Protestant in the Low Countries and Scandinavia did, why would England? Well, because I think it would. There's a degree of detachment from Rome. Rome's a long way from England and Scotland and Scandinavia. It's not so far away from southern France and southern Germany and Italy, obviously, and even Greece and obviously. Serbia and Russia, they essentially broke from Rome. It's a much more complicated process, but they weren't under the yoke of the Roman Catholic Church. So I think distance would have, as much as anything else, why am I listening to somebody from a foreign country? So when I have my own views, and it gets rid of layers of bureaucracy in terms of these rich bishops and stuff, which, again, appeals to educated people. Didn't happen in Ireland, but then Ireland had a problem with England. So maybe the difference in the real history, the difference between England and Ireland was, yes, it was religion, but it was also cultural as well. So the religion was an excuse.
Yeah.
You
Of course,
know.
we're not talking about Wales either, so it would have had an impact in Wales. But,
Well, yeah, I mean, Wales became Protestant, didn't it? Or Methodist stroke chapel.
yeah,
Not.
I don't understand what I don't know
It's
whether
it's
chapel is a
it's
Methodist
it's a
type.
form of pluralism, isn't it? That they don't believe in hierarchies. So so in my
So it
simplest,
was the Scottish type.
well, yes, but
you know,
but distinct.
fairly
But
severe
there was nobody from
Protestantism.
Scotland going and telling people.
Oh, no,
no, but it's quite it's less severe than Presbyterianism. It's slightly more pragmatic, shall we say? Although Presbyterianism is not all about what in Scotland's called the wee free. We double E as in small, free, the Free Church of Scotland, which broke from the Presbyterian Church of Scotland or the Church of Scotland. And these are the chariots of fire. I'm not running in the Olympics on a Sunday. You don't hang your washing out on a Sunday. You don't kick footballs on a Sunday. There's still a bit like Scotland today, but it's all very the Western Isles.
Yeah.
That was never the main theme. That was an extreme sect that came along in the 1800s. But so Wales would have been.
Yeah,
I think,
I just wanted to throw that in because we hadn't mentioned it. So back on the timeline then. So we're moving forward. We've made the assumption that England ultimately would turn away from Catholicism through its monarchy.
Yeah, I think the monarchy would have just been irrelevant. I mean, there are probably some countries even, where the monarchy is a different religion. Even today, I mean, obviously,
not the big Catholic ones. I mean, France and Spain are the two obvious ones.
I was thinking just over time. I mean, even in the Far East, for all I know. I mean, the obvious place is India. I mean, many of the Mughals were Muslim. Look, until the British and the French turned up, and the vast majority of the people below them are Hindus, and that seemed to work. Whether how happy they were about it, who knows?
Yeah.
But,
well, let's just because it's an event. And whether it would have happened or not happened, which is the gunpowder plot, because that's another Catholic Protestant type thing. And arguably, it probably would it have happened? Maybe not. It'd be another historic event in British history.
There's been a bit of revisionist on history on that, though. Yes, it was a Protestant Catholic thing, but it was also an anti-Scottish thing as well, which is again. Every generation of historians has stuff.
Was it James the First? Was it? I can't remember. James the First.
It was James the Second. James the Second. But
it was James the Second. Yeah.
Every generation of historians have to have a reason to sell a book, so they'll come up with different versions.
But he was a wrong un now, James the Second, wasn't he? Because he forced the Great Revolution, didn't he? Because he got ousted by Parliament.
Yes, indeed, by William of Orange.
Yeah.
But then that was a there was more to it than just religion, but religion was the major player. But
so you think that would still have happened then?
I think that would have happened. That's an example of how Protestantism really, William of Orange, I mean, stating blindly obvious, was a Protestant. Again, an example of how, irrespective of who the monarchy was, that Protestancy was the coming thing in certain parts of prosperous urban. It's too early to say industrialized because it isn't quite industrialized by that stage, but prosperous urban trade-based economies were turning toward Protestantism. And you can say, well, France wasn't, and Spain wasn't, and Italy wasn't. Yes, but then they had proximity to Rome, so, and they had slightly different economies as well. But if you look at the Baltic states and the Scandinavian states, which before the transatlantic trade to the Americas was the primary trade for most of England and Scotland, the Baltic routes across the North Sea, most of those countries were turning toward Protestantism, and they did through the Glorious Revolution, or whatever it was called, in where was it, 1698, which replaced. So that you can argue that the real timeline shows what might have happened in any case. Whether
So what we're saying is that that event is likely to have continued.
Yeah,
James II was James II. So one of the key things about the Glorious Revolution was that it removed certain powers from royalty, from the king or the queen. Yeah, and that's a key thing in terms of the British monarchy as a difference to French monarchy and Spanish monarchy. In terms of they still had absolute rule, whereas Britain was still
the thing. Yeah, but the thing to remember in our timeline is that the Glorious Revolution. I mean, William of Orange turns up with 15,000 Dutch troops, but he's been invited, inverted commas, to come to England by the great and the good. The great and the good in our timeline, most of them could have been still Catholic. So they wouldn't necessarily have invited William of Orange to come.
No, but they would have arguably invited somebody. So the monarchy would have
King of Spain, but I mean,
Yeah, but it would have been the monarchy would have continued, is what I meant.
Yeah.
and Parliament had already taken powers from the king. The King of Spain's not going to come to England and not with a king, because he's already king in Spain in terms of his total authority.
Yeah.
Whereas in England, the king's powers had been curbed. That was one of the things that had happened.
Yeah.
That the king couldn't actually dictate policy.
But then would a Catholic king in a Catholic country, would that process of removing his whatever the terminology is, but
well, he could have been a cousin of Prince Philip,
but
whoever the king of Spain was.
But would that have had to be referred to the Pope?
Well, but we're saying that. I mean, don't forget, we are talking. The timeline was that England was becoming more Protestant.
Well, okay, yeah, that's fine. Which it was in reality anyway.
Yeah, so it could still have been William.
But,
Yeah,
okay.
That's what I meant. Is that if we got to the point where, say, it was James who starts the transition because he's Scottish, it's Scotland's Protestant.
Although he was a Catholic, so that
I know.
Yeah,
but I'm just pushing that part that he was Scottish. There's more Scottish influence. Yeah. There might have been more influence for Protestantism, certainly in the the landed gentry and the those two, that level of society, because we are saying that England becomes Protestant. I mean, ultimately, that's what is likely to happen.
I think it is, because as we said before, look at the countries around it. France is a bit of an outlier, but if you look at the Low Countries and Scandinavia and Scotland, which is an immediate neighbour, yes, irrespective of what happens to the king and monarchy or the queen, it becomes.
Yeah, the thing with France, though, if you remember, is that they lost their royalty.
Indeed,
they removed it.
That's the thing,
as well as their heads.
That's quite a long way along our timeline.
Well, if we talk about the American, the revolutionary, anyway, we were talking about the revolution.
Yeah, but I was suggesting that the colonies would try and become independent earlier, on our timeline, because they would be so different from England by that stage. They would be mostly Catholic, and England potentially would become Protestant by osmosis, but they don't leave because there was many more of them.
No, I understand that.
So the interesting thing is that we're almost at summary that. It almost, there's the thing. What would happen to the monasteries and their wealth? So that would have restricted his ability to do things. But I think the summary is, which is kind of a good thing, is that kings and queens, by this stage, aren't the country. So kings and queens don't, or the monarchy doesn't actually mould the country that much.
Well, I mean, and British monarchs had their power eroded when they were Catholic anyway.
So it's almost as if whatever their religion doesn't matter. If the people choose, not immediately obviously, but over a period of 50, 60 years or 100 years to move from Catholicism to Protestantism, and arguably to now to not atheism, but indifference of religion. And we've got today a monarch who's the head of the Church of England. What difference does that make? Makes no difference to anybody's life.
No. Especially when their power's eroded. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, that's the point. And if their powers aren't eroded, well, it's almost, but the powers are eroded because people come to the conclusion it's ridiculous having one person with all these powers. And apart from anything else, it's what they do with the powers. It usually involves taxation without representation. We've heard that before. It usually involves foreign wars. We've heard that before. And people don't want it. And as we say, the common people don't have much of a voice, but they do by definition of the mass and the landed gentry, the squire level, if you like. They're aware of what the people want. They want the same as the people by and large. They want to make money. They don't want somebody to come and take all the money away from them. They don't want their sons being sent abroad on foreign wars. So it's a sort of a path of human development that says, I don't care about religion in as much as you keep your religion out of my business. That's fine. As soon as you start putting your religion into my business, that's when, and I don't necessarily just mean business, I mean life, that's when people start pushing against it. And arguably, Protestantism was less of an intrusion in the people's lives than Catholicism was. It's less censorious, it's less, I'm probably showing my background here, but it's
surely not.
It's less in your life telling you what you should be doing, arguably. It's certainly less, it's certainly not taking as much money or ostentatious money in terms of palaces and cathedrals and stuff. So people move away from that. It doesn't matter what your king says. And if your king doesn't like it, what can you do about it? He tries to do something about it, you have a civil war. And lo and behold, you had a civil war. But it wasn't just about it. None of some of the War of the Nations, as it's sometimes known as, was religious based. but most of it wasn't.
So we're sort of concluding that at the point where we say the changes, it comes in, which is Henry VIII, there's a blip. There's a little bit of a couple of consequences associated with that. One could be Ireland, one could be North America.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the way England was going to go would have still happened, but a bit later on.
Yeah, and
100, 200
it might have been a little bit,
and a different form of it, but ultimately...
it might have been slightly more, ironically, in the earlier part of it, it might be slightly less extreme because it had been less Puritan, but going much further down a timeline into the 1800s and 19th century, it might have been more Puritan or more extreme because it'd be more Protestant, be more marching into parts of the world because they're not religious enough or Christian enough. So it might be more later on.
Then it depends on whether it's a Puritan type Protestantism or the Scottish type of Protestantism. That wasn't Puritan.
It's slightly more pragmatic. But yeah. Or not just Scottish, but you think of the Scandinavian and the North German and the Low Countries. Yes, they had colonies. Yes, they had empires and stuff, but they weren't.
And I don't think it would have had any impact in late, even like the 1800s or the 1900s, even if, that the whatever conflicts, and we always talk about conflicts, would almost certainly have happened.
No, I don't think the country would have developed. And there is an argument already, there's an argument out there that is quite well versed that why did Britain, as it would have been by then, and Germany, or certainly the northern part of Germany, develop industrially quicker than Catholic countries like Spain and Italy and stuff? Well, because they didn't have this stupefying Catholic hierarchy telling people what they could and couldn't do. You can't educate these people. You can't educate them in anything other than this stuff. So people were thinking about things like, they would want to make money. They wanted mines. They wanted steam engines to pump out the water. They wanted, trains, etc., etc., etc. They wanted mills. They wanted, all that sort of stuff. That obviously did happen in Catholic countries, but again, the rate of change arguably was quicker in Protestant countries because the freedom of thought. You weren't being told what to think. Yeah.
So it could have had an impact on the Industrial Revolution, but it wouldn't have stopped it. Is one of the things that.
Again, it depends. It depends ultimately how extreme those in charge at the very top. So we're talking, the monarchy and the very top. How much they would defend their Catholicism.
Yeah.
If they chose not to defend it too hard, it would have no impact. If they defended it too hard, it would have caused yet another civil war, or the civil war that happened anyway, but it would just been completely because of religion rather than all the other conflicting ideas of Parliament versus monarchy and all the rest of it.
Okay.
So as usual, I think we've concluded it made no difference whatsoever.
Well, it did make some difference, but grand scheme of things, it didn't make any significance. I think that the two things that we pointed out, I think would have been significant, but not necessarily.
Well, it's my bias, but I'm always amazed that, even though that we don't necessarily write down how it's going to happen. Well, we don't write down how it's going to happen.
We're very professional.
Yeah, just a plot spoiler there for a bit. Is that how much of it's based on social attitudes and how people want to live their lives and how they're able to live their lives. It's amazing how much that has an impact on it.
Well, I'm hoping that the people who are listening on our Twitter page, or whatever it's called these days, have some views. This one,
still call it Twitter.
Yeah. So this might warrant a fair few comments.
Yep.
Let's hope so.
If you think we're wrong, tell us where. If you think we're right, tell us where. If you couldn't care less, tell us that as well. Tell us what you'd like to talk about. As you've probably seen, we are a little bit biased towards everything. Seems to default to warfare, but it doesn't. We're trying to avoid that. At least we haven't mentioned the H word, as for those Brits who are talking, as allegedly every British argument ends in somebody being called Hitler after about 5 minutes. So we've not done any of that so far. But if you want to talk about other topics, we're up for it. Just let us know.
Please let us know. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch up with you on the next episode. Goodbye.
Bye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.